I never expected her to remember my name, let alone everything else. It was a Wednesday morning, the kind of morning where the coffee shop smelled like old pastries and rain waiting outside. I pushed the door open, letting the small bell announce me, and found her already behind the counter, wiping down the espresso machine with deliberate care. Her hair was pulled back loosely, a few strands stubbornly escaping, and she wore that faded cardigan that looked like it belonged to someone who'd lived through more than I could guess. "Morning, Matt," she said, and I froze for half a second, because usually I just got "hey." Her tone had a softness that didn't need punctuation. It made me feel like I belonged here, in a small, almost imperceptible way. Morning," I said, fumbling my wallet as if the cashier's smile could undo my own awkwardness. She glanced at my usual, a plain black coffee with 2 sugars, and already had the cup ready before I could say anything. She handed it over with a nod, and I noticed the way her fingers lingered on the cup's edge a second longer than necessary. Tiny, almost meaningless gestures, but somehow they felt deliberate. I slid onto my usual stool by the window, the one that let me watch the street without anyone noticing. The rain had started, soft at first, tapping against the glass. I had my notebook out, but my pen hovered in the air. I wasn't writing anything. I was just watching her move, folding a napkin neatly in her hand, leaning slightly to reach a sugar packet, the quiet rhythm of someone who did this every day but still made it look unplanned. "You're quiet today," she said, leaning against the counter like she'd just noticed I existed in this little universe of hers. I muttered. I didn't want to explain that quiet wasn't sadness exactly. It was the pause between messages I never sent, the small habit of staring at my phone and closing it again. It was noticing her hands and pretending it wasn't distracting. She smiled, small, maybe teasing, maybe just curious, and it made me feel both seen and invisible at the same time. "Coffee's good," she asked. "Yeah, perfect," I said, though perfect wasn't the coffee. It was the way she remembered, the way she slid it across without a word, like it was already mine. We fell into that quiet back and forth, no one else really there, just the rain and the hum of the espresso machine. I wanted to say something, but the words kept slipping past, folding into the space between us. I flicked my eyes toward her hands again, watching as she stacked a few cups with careful precision. Then, just as I thought I could leave without anything extraordinary happening, she looked up at me, paused, and said, "Are you coming to Jamie's later?" My heart stumbled in a way it hadn't in months. Jamie was her son, my friend, the guy who thought I didn't notice how she laughed when he called her dramatic. I didn't answer immediately. I wanted to, but I also wanted to make sure I understood what I'd just heard. Yeah, I guess," I said finally, trying not to overcommit, trying not to betray that every morning I came here, I hoped she'd say something just like that. She nodded, tipping her head slightly, and I felt that quiet tug again, like something had shifted but I wasn't sure what. I sipped my coffee slowly, letting the warmth seep in, while the rain outside grew steadier. The street blurred beyond the glass, and for a moment, it felt like the world outside didn't exist. And then her hand rested on the counter, close to mine, not touching, just close enough that I noticed. Close enough that I couldn't stop noticing. A few days later, I found myself at her apartment, ostensibly to drop off a book Jamie had left behind. The hallway smelled faintly of laundry detergent and old wood, something warm and familiar. She opened the door before I could knock properly, still in her cardigan, hair tied back loosely, like the first day I noticed her. "Hey," she said, holding the book out to me. Our fingers brushed, and I felt a little spark. Nothing electric, just noticeable. "Thanks," I said, shifting the weight from one foot to the other, suddenly aware of the quiet hum of her apartment. The ticking clock, a cup drying on the counter, the faint sound of a neighbor's television. "I was just making some tea," she said, stepping aside. "You want some?" I nodded, and we settled at her small kitchen table. Steam curled from our cups, the aroma faintly sweet, a comfort in the hush between us. I noticed how her hands wrapped around the mug, knuckles white against the ceramic, and for a moment, I wondered what it must be like to hold someone's attention like that, quietly, without even trying. She spoke first, sharing a memory about her son when he was a kid. Jamie used to hide in the laundry basket when he was upset. I'd find him hours later, and he'd just stare at me like I was supposed to know what to do. She laughed softly, not at me, but at the memory itself. I guess I learned a lot about patience back then. I smiled, unsure what to say. I never thought about how much you must have seen him grow up. My voice sounded too loud in the small apartment. She shrugged lightly, eyes flicking toward the window. It's what parents do, I guess. See things, even when they don't say it. I swallowed, thinking about the things I didn't say, messages never sent, imagined confessions folded into my chest. There was a weight to this, the quiet sense that we were tiptoeing around something we both sensed but didn't name. She was his mother, 40-something, divorced, and I was barely 20. The thought of it should have been enough to stop me, but it wasn't. We sat in silence for a few minutes, sipping tea, letting the conversation ebb. My eyes wandered to her hands again, how they rested on the table, relaxed yet precise. I imagined her brushing her fingers over mine by accident, and then I shook my head, forcing the thought away. I don't know why I keep talking about him, she said suddenly, a little softer, almost like she was confessing to herself. Maybe because it's easier than talking about everything else. Everything else? I asked, leaning slightly forward, careful not to overstep. She looked up, eyes meeting mine for a fraction too long, and a quiet tension hung there, unsaid but unmistakable. Then she smiled, lightly, almost teasing, and reached over to adjust a napkin that had slipped. Her fingers brushed mine. Quick, casual, but the effect lingered far longer than the touch itself. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. That little gesture, a near touch, a shared glance, said everything I couldn't. I left with the book clutched in one hand, the other lingering on the thought of her eyes and hands, and the way she made silence feel alive. I don't know why that moment stayed with me. Maybe because it felt like someone finally saw me. The next week, I stopped by the cafe later than usual. Rain had left everything damp and shiny, and the streets smelled of wet asphalt. She was stacking plates behind the counter when I walked in. "Hey," I said, voice low, unsure if it was a greeting or an invitation. "Hey," she replied, eyes flicking up, then down, then up again. That tiny hesitation, the pause before recognition, made me notice her more than usual. I perched on my usual stool, coffee already waiting, or maybe it was just the familiarity of routine. She handed it over with a small, almost imperceptible smile, and I caught the way her fingers lingered a fraction too long on the cup. We started cleaning up together after the morning rush, stacking plates, wiping tables. My hands brushed hers occasionally, brief, accidental, but enough to make my chest tighten. "You okay?" she asked quietly. I paused, unsure if she meant physically, mentally, everything. "Yeah, just thinking." She nodded slowly, not pressing. That made me want to speak anyway, to fill the quiet with something real, but the words got tangled in my throat. I imagined saying her name, hearing it back, leaning just a little too close. My hand hovered near hers, then I pulled it back. Halfway through, the door chimed, and Jamie walked in with a friend. He waved, laughing about something trivial. She stiffened, smiled at him, and I felt that sudden pull back, as if the invisible line I hadn't acknowledged had been redrawn. I sank back into my seat, pretending to sip coffee, but my gaze kept drifting. Every glance she threw my way lingered longer than casual. I wanted to ask if she noticed, wanted to see her hesitation, wanted to trace that pause in her movements. We slipped into quiet conversation again, small jokes, murmured observations. Her hand moved closer to mine when she reached for the sugar, but stopped midair, almost shy, almost daring. My breath caught. I could imagine, if I let myself, the curve of her shoulder, the brush of her hair, the way her lips might feel if we. I shook my head, forcing the thought away. But then she tilted her head toward me, almost imperceptibly, eyes softening, and I leaned in without realizing it. A fraction of a second, a hair's breadth too close. The moment shattered when she cleared her throat, stepped back, hands folding over the counter. "I should get back to this," she said, voice steady but quiet, like she was anchoring herself to something safe. I nodded, staring down at my coffee, tasting nothing, feeling everything. I left that day with the echo of nearly touching, nearly speaking, nearly crossing a line we both knew existed. The rain had stopped, but the tension it left behind clung, heavier than the damp air outside. And I realized I didn't know how long I could keep this quiet. The hesitation, the glance, the brush of hands, without it breaking me in some way I couldn't name. I found her sitting on the small park bench near the river after her shift. The sky was bruised gray, clouds hanging low like they could spill any second. I hesitated before approaching, aware of the small distance between us. Not just the physical space, but all the unspoken rules we'd been tiptoeing around. "Hey," I said softly, sliding onto the other end of the bench. She didn't move, just let her fingers trace the rim of her coffee cup. Steam curled into the chill air. "Hey," she replied, quieter than usual. I noticed a tension in her shoulders, in the way she kept glancing toward the empty path behind us, as if expecting someone to appear and break this fragile bubble. We sat in silence for a while, the river moving slow beneath the clouds. My thoughts spiraled, as they always did, imagined scenarios, almost confessions, fleeting touches that shouldn't exist. I felt that quiet ache, the one that made the world feel both impossibly close and unbearably far. Finally, she spoke, not looking at me. "I saw Jamie today with someone at the cafe. He seemed happy." Her voice was calm, but there was a tight edge, a restraint I could hear. "Yeah," I muttered, unsure what to say. My chest tightened. Jealousy? Fear? Desire? I couldn't untangle it. He always seems happy." She glanced at me, eyes soft but sharp, measuring, as if deciding how much to reveal. I don't know why I let you in so easily. It's complicated." I shifted slightly, heart hammering against quiet restraint. "I know," I said, almost too low to hear. "I shouldn't even be here." "I shouldn't." She held up a hand, stopping me mid-sentence, and I noticed the tremble in her fingers. It's not simple. Her words hung, unfinished, like the air itself was holding them back. I leaned a little closer, trying not to, caught in that magnetism that had been building, and she didn't pull away immediately. My hand brushed the bench near hers, a careful, almost accidental proximity. "I don't know why it feels like this," she said finally, voice quieter than the river's murmur. "But I can't pretend it's nothing." I swallowed, pulse loud in my ears, words tangling inside me. I wanted to say her name, to tell her she mattered more than I'd admit to anyone else, but the confession stuck in my throat. She shifted, turning her face slightly toward me, a glance that held both warning and invitation. My hand twitched toward hers, but I stopped. The river gurgled below, wind teasing the hair at her temple, and the world felt suspended in that split second. "Do we?" I thought, unspoken, letting the question hang like a fragile glass between us. She didn't answer, only let her gaze linger, and for a moment, the pause said everything. The next week, the cafe felt different. I walked in, expecting the usual warmth, the faint scent of coffee and something personal, something hers, but she wasn't there. Just the hum of machines, a few regulars murmuring to themselves, and the barista I didn't know well enough to talk to. I asked about her. "Oh, she had to step out. Family stuff," the barista said, not looking at me. That wasn't unusual, but the way they said it, clipped, careful, made my stomach knot. I tried calling later. No answer. Left a message I didn't expect her to return. The phone felt heavier in my hand than it had in months. I imagined her somewhere else, somewhere quiet, not thinking of me. Or worse, thinking of me and deciding I wasn't worth it. A few days passed, and when I finally saw her at the grocery store, she barely glanced my way. She smiled faintly at someone else, then turned her attention to the shelves, her fingers brushing cans with distracted care. The small magnetism that had pulled me in, the laughter, the coffee, the quiet attention, was gone, or at least carefully hidden. "I haven't seen you in a while," I said, voice catching, unsure if I was seeking an explanation or just confirming that I existed. She nodded, eyes avoiding mine. "Yeah, busy," she said. No warmth, No pause, just the words like a closed door. I noticed the faint bruise under her sleeve, a glimpse of vulnerability, a story she wasn't telling. Is everything okay? She shook her head slightly, then looked away, lips pressed together. It's complicated, she said, almost whispering, almost for herself. Her son wasn't mentioned, but the tension around it thickened the air. I realized she was carrying more than I could guess. Exes, responsibilities, maybe old regrets. And I was somewhere in the edges of that, like a sentence unfinished. I went back to the cafe the next day, seat by the window empty, my usual coffee untouched, mind running loops of what I could have done differently. I wanted to knock, to ask, to say something, anything, but I didn't. Instead, I stared at the steam rising from the cup I didn't order, listening to the chatter around me, waiting for a sign that the world hadn't moved on without me. But there wasn't one. I tried writing a message that never left my phone. Words stacked in the draft, unsent. I don't know if I should. I just want to know. By the end of the week, I didn't feel heartbroken. I felt paused, like life forgot to finish the sentence. I left the cafe that evening with the memory of her hands brushing mine, the near confessions, the half glances, all tangled up in my chest. The door clicked behind me, and the empty seat by the window stared back, patient, silent, accusing. Found her at the apartment again, this time not expecting her. The hallway smelled faintly of rain and something like cinnamon, and she opened the door slowly, surprised but not exactly upset to see me. "Hey," I said, voice low. "Hey," she replied, leaning against the doorframe. Her hands were empty, and for a moment I wondered if she'd been doing something, anything, just to avoid me. We moved to the small kitchen, the space cramped but familiar. I could see the faint tremor in her hands as she reached for the kettle. Steam rose between us, curling like it always did, softening the edges of the room, softening the edges of us. I haven't seen you," I started and stopped. My throat felt tight. The words I'd rehearsed all week tangled in my chest. She looked at me, quietly waiting. There was an invitation there, a pause that asked me to step in or step back. I didn't know if I should come, I admitted finally, voice rough. "Or if you wanted me to." Her gaze softened, and the small exhale she let out carried more weight than anything she could have said. "I didn't know either," she whispered. We moved slowly around the kitchen, our hands brushing while drying dishes, arranging cups. Every touch felt deliberate, careful, but it wasn't heavy. It was just noticing. Small acknowledgments, small acts of trust. I started again, but she held my gaze, and I realized I could say the words now. "I think about you. More than I probably should." She froze, then leaned slightly closer, not touching, just allowing the space between us to shrink. "I think about you too," she said softly, almost letting the sentence hang unfinished. The cost of saying it was heavy. I thought of Jamie, of the world outside, of the lines we weren't supposed to cross. But the weight of silence felt heavier still. We stopped what we were doing, hands hovering near the counter, eyes locked. The room was quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the kettle finishing its whistle. Finally, she smiled, small, careful, real. And I smiled back, letting it settle between us like a fragile truce with ourselves. "Okay," she said, voice soft, almost for herself. "Okay," I echoed. No dramatic confession, no grand gesture, just a small acknowledgement of everything we'd felt and almost said, and a quiet understanding that whatever happened next, the moment existed, and that was enough for now. We continued with the dishes after that, not touching more than necessary, but the space between us had shifted. The tension had softened, replaced with something quieter, deeper, a small, human connection that could carry us, even if the rest of the world remained as complicated as it always had been. Weeks passed. The mornings returned to their usual rhythm, but something had shifted. I still went to the cafe at 8:47 a.m., still ordered black coffee with 2 sugars, still slipped onto my usual stool, but now, I noticed her before the routine did. She moved behind the counter with that same careful grace, and sometimes, just sometimes, she caught my eye and held it for a heartbeat longer than necessary. We weren't perfect, There were days when Jamie's presence reminded us of the lines we'd crossed, and days when life's small chaos, bills, errands, the endless hum of responsibilities, kept us apart. But there were also the quiet victories: shared tea at her kitchen table, walks along the river bench when the city was still half asleep, the comfort of hands brushing while folding laundry or stacking plates. One afternoon, the cafe was almost empty. I carried a cup of coffee toward the window, and she followed, carrying a small plate of pastries. We settled side by side, the steam from our drinks mingling. I didn't say much. She didn't either. But when our fingers touched briefly on the table, there was a softness there that felt like home. I remembered the first time we'd sat on that park bench together, the rain heavy but quiet between us, and I realized how far we'd come. We'd navigated hesitation, near confessions, and silences that could have swallowed us whole. Yet here we were, ordinary and unremarkable to anyone else, but deeply tethered to each other in ways words could barely hold. She glanced at me over her cup, a faint, knowing smile tugging at her lips. I returned it, feeling the small pulse of intimacy settle comfortably between us. No fanfare, no grand declaration, just recognition. I see you. You see me. Enough. Later, when we walked home, the city smelled faintly of rain and exhaust, the streets lined with familiar sounds and shadows. She paused to adjust my scarf for the 100th time, brushing a stray strand of hair from my forehead. My fingers lingered at hers a moment longer, and we both laughed softly, quietly, without needing to fill the silence. Back at her apartment, the kettle whistled, black coffee brewed in the familiar mug. We sipped together, and I realized the ache that had once filled the spaces between us. The almost touch, the paused words, the unsent messages, had softened into a gentle warmth. Not perfection, not fantasy, just real, grounded life, shared in small, deliberate gestures. As I left that evening, she waved from the doorway, coffee cup in hand, and I paused at the threshold, thinking about everything that had led us here. And in that moment, I understood. The bench, the black coffee at 8:47 a.m., the near misses, the quiet touches, they weren't just memories. They were markers of something only we could know, something quietly ours. I smiled, the kind of smile that held both relief and recognition, and walked down the hallway with the comforting weight of her presence lingering like an echo only I could hear.